Affirming this proposition will be Dr. Wallace I. Matson, Professor of Philosophy, University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Matson is internationally known for his ability and scholarship in his defense of the atheistic position. He received the A.B., the M.A., the Ph.D. degrees from the University of California in Berkeley. He has been visiting lecturer or professor at a number of prestigious universities. This past spring at Cambridge University in England. His writings are known extensively among philosophers and theologians. He has received the following fellowships: the Guggenheim, 1961-62, National Endowment for the Humanities, 1971-72, Humanities Research, 1974, and 1977 and 78, all at Cambridge University. Among the publications of Dr. Matson are A History of Philosophy and The Existence of God, and the latest, Sentience. Dr. Matson, both by training and experience, is as qualified as any we know to oppose the proposition he is affirming tonight. In the negative, the first two nights is Dr. Thomas B. Warren, who is Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Christian Apologetics at the Hardin Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee. He received his B.S. from Abilene Christian University, the M.A. from the University of Houston, the M.A. and the Ph.D. degree from Vanderbilt University. He has authored more than 20 books, including Have Atheists Proved There Is No God?, The Warren Clue Debate on the Existence of God. He is a member of the American Philosophical and Philosophy of Science Association and the Southwestern Philosophical Society. Dr. Warren is editor of The Spiritual Sword, a staff writer for the Gospel Advocate, and a regular speaker on the radio program 5 Gospel Minutes. He serves as minister of the Brownsville Road Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. We know of no one by training and experience who is better qualified to deny the proposition affirmed by Dr. Matson than is Dr. Warren. It will be the obligation of the affirmative speaker to set forth evidence that warrants the conclusion which he has affirmed. For Dr. Matson, tonight and tomorrow night, the burden of proof rests on his shoulders. He must present evidence that warrants the conclusion that I know that God, that is the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, does not exist. It will be the obligation of the negative speaker each evening to give careful attention to the evidence which has been presented, to evaluate that evidence in the light of the proposition being affirmed, and to show that the proposition is not sustained. Assisting Dr. Warren as moderators will be Robert Camp and Roy Deaver. Assisting Dr. Matson will be David Raleigh. Since Dr. Matson is in the affirmative this evening, we're now turning the floor to Dr. Matson.
Thank you, Mr. Steersman. Before I begin, I'd also like to thank Dr. Warren and the Church of Christ who arranged this debate. I don't know the Bible as well as I should, but it seems to me that St. Paul does say somewhere, test your faith. I'm sure he says hold fast to it, and maybe he says both. But anyway, it certainly is admirable of the Church of Christ that they not only tolerate challenges, but even go out of their way to import the challenger from far away and at enormous expense. I'm particularly conscious of the honor that's been done me in inviting me to sit in the hot seat that has been previously occupied by my distinguished English friend and brother in atheism, Anthony Flew. Before I get down to nitty-gritty, though, there are a few matters I need to say something about or ask about. One of them really is, what is the purpose of this debate? I asked Dr. Warren what he considered to be the principal purpose or purposes of these debates, and I gave him a number of possible choices: enlightenment, strengthening of the faith, moral uplift, entertainment, or other. And he replied as follows: enlightenment, yes. Strengthening of the faith, well, he crossed out faith and put in faithful and said yes. Moral uplift, yes. And then also he wrote in to prove that God exists and to stress the significance of this fact. But for entertainment, he put in capital letters an exclamation point, no. Well, I at least hope that besides all these other things that are checked, there might be just a little bit of entertainment about this if you're going to come out 4 nights for it. I'm certainly not a wrestler or a stand-up comedian, but I see nothing wrong with enjoyment. And if theological disputes are not commonly thought of as showbiz, well, it was not always so. Until fairly recently, they were a standard sideshow of coronations, royal weddings, victory celebrations, and all that sort of thing. Though in Spain, they went in for stronger stuff. They substituted the public burning of heretics. Now we might, for all I know, be in for a revival of this. At any rate, the house here tonight is fantastic. At least I should think so for an affair of this sort, at least where I come from, but I'm very much conscious of being in another part of the world. I doubt, though, whether it will ever replace Monday Night Football. Well, so much for entertainment, which is a trivial matter, I suppose. The question before us is, does God, a particular specified God, exist? I doubt whether that's really a question like, does life exist on Mars? If we were debating that, I suppose people would come and present evidence on one side and evidence on the other side. And in the audience, there would be people who hadn't made up their minds, who came to be enlightened on this and wanted to know and didn't know when they came and knew or thought they knew when they went away. I doubt whether very many here are in that kind of situation. I think this question is more emotional. Most people's minds, I guess, are made up on this already, and I doubt very much whether either I or Dr. Warren is going to change very many. And I should certainly not be disappointed if I don't make any converts, or even if some from my side go away to Dr. Warren. I'm not out to make converts. In fact, I'd be a little embarrassed about it because I must remember that, after all, I might just possibly be wrong, in which case, if I made a convert, I'd be damning him to hell, wouldn't I? I suppose this is more like a football game where you come to cheer your team, but then cheering has been forbidden, so I better leave that aside. Maybe even more closely a wrestling match. And I guess if it's a wrestling match, I'm the bad guy and ought to appear in black trunks or something. I didn't have any such, but I wore a black tie, notice, and that'll serve to remind you if you need it. There are little red doohickeys on it, but you shouldn't think of those as suggesting that maybe I've come here to represent the devil. I'm not the devil's advocate. As we shall see very shortly, that title belongs to Dr. Warren. Well, one more matter before we can start off. I have to comment a little bit on the publicity release, part of which was included in Mr. Steersman's very gracious introduction. It says of me, and this is perfectly honest things, honestly intended, but I do have to correct it. It said, quote, I quote from the publicity handout, presently he is the visiting professor in philosophy at Cambridge University, England, end quote. Now, it's true that I am a professor of philosophy, and it's true when that was written, I was visiting England. But those don't add up to being the visiting professor of philosophy in Cambridge University. I know that none of you here could care less about that, but I have to put that on the record if I ever want to go back to Cambridge University, which I do. All right, now to a somewhat more interesting, I hope, matter. The publicity also speaks of me as, quote, known for his defense of the atheistic position, end quote. I don't say that's false, but I do think it deserves some comment. I wrote a book, which Mr. Steersman also mentioned, called The Existence of God, in which I argued that there's no good reason for believing that any God, which I define more or less as a supernatural person in at least partial control of the world. I said, there's no good reason to believe that a God exists, and that there is a very good, indeed a conclusive reason, to believe that no God with a capital G exists. And I define God with a capital G as a person, that is, a being with intellect and will, and the ability to act in accordance with the will. A person who is infinitely or perfectly knowing, powerful, or good. Well, is that atheism? You can call it so if you like. And I suppose that in an ordinary acceptation of the term here, that would be so. But I'd like to take a look at the word atheism first. It's a Greek word. There are 3 syllables, and each one comes from a separate element in Greek. There's the a, which is just a negative, not or non, and the the, which is from the word theos, meaning God, and then the ist, which is just ist, or maybe it's more English to say er. So literally, an atheist means non-God-er, non-Godder. Follow me? Now, whether a given person is or isn't an atheist depends not only on what he believes, but also on where he is and at what time he's there. As readers of Gore Vidal's novel Julian are well aware, this word atheist was the standard term that the pagans of the Greco-Roman world used to apply to Christians. The Christians were non-Godders at that time and place. That is, they disbelieved, they utterly rejected Jupiter, Mars, and all those others. And if Dr. Ward and I went to Timbuktu or to India today, we would be atheists together. How many gods have been worshipped altogether in the history of the worship of mankind? I don't know. I don't know of any census. But let's say it's 1 million. The number must be staggering. 1 million is surely a conservative estimate. Well, I reject all of them. So that makes me a millionfold atheist, if you like. But Dr. Warren, I think, rejects 999,999 of them. So the numerical difference turns out to be fairly tiny. It might even be a tie if you count the God of the philosopher Spinoza. Spinoza says an awful lot about God. And I think maybe I acknowledge the God of Spinoza. But I won't press that point. Spinoza, after all, was kicked out of the synagogue and universally execrated as an atheist by all parties. In other words, I'm not apologizing or rejecting the term atheist, but I do want to get it into context where it belongs. Anyway, we're not here to debate atheism in general. We're here to debate a much more restricted proposition. We're here to debate an admirably clear one. I have agreed to defend the following proposition. You've heard it, but permit me to repeat it. Quote, I know that God, parenthesis, that is, the God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell, end parenthesis, does not exist, end quote. Now that's not a proposition to which I paid any attention in my book on the existence of God. And I did not compose that proposition for this debate. I assume that Dr. Warren did. At any rate, I didn't. But I accept it, and I want to commend Dr. Warren, or whoever did compose it, for its definiteness and its orthodoxy. Neither one of these, definiteness or orthodoxy, is very usual in philosophical, theological discussions nowadays, and more's the pity, I think. Very many people who profess to be theists, and even Christians, even priests and ministers, when pressed on what they mean by God, are apt to take refuge in expressions like love, or perhaps William James's, I offer this only as an example, formula, force not ourselves that makes for righteousness. What are you going to do to confront somebody like that? Of course, some human beings love some other human beings, and so on, in some sense. So love exists, and if God is love in that sense, then God exists. So there's nothing to discuss. Whether or not there's a force not ourselves that makes for righteousness is a proposition that's very difficult to make out. And really, I think there's little point in discussing it. If you believe it and I don't, there seems to be very little reason that either of us can give other than just his hunch. But it's different with this. God of the New Testament, who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell. We know, or I think we know, or I think I know exactly what that proposition means. And it can profitably be discussed. We can bring up things that tend in its favor and against it. Moreover, and here I come to the orthodoxy part of this, moreover, it brings out into the open a subject that defenders of Christianity nowadays almost unanimously seem to want to hush up, namely the biblical teaching about hell. Now this teaching is there in the New Testament, and it's not going to go away. That is short of a complete rewriting of the Bible, and some things lead me to suspect that perhaps that's not a complete impossibility anymore. But, at least at present, it's there, and Dr. Warren's candor in facing this issue, indeed forcing it on us, is, in my opinion, altogether commendable. That's one reason why I was happy to debate this proposition. Now, let's consider this proposition a little further, and start at the beginning with the word no, because it doesn't only state this God doesn't exist, but also I know that it. Now this word know, K-N-O-W, is a word that terrifies, or at least induces acute spasms of nervousness in philosophers, because we are professionally aware of how many awful pitfalls there are lurking around any assertion to really and truly know anything, for sure, with no possibility of being mistaken. Philosophers who throw this word know around and don't use it with proper circumspection and prayer and fasting and so on, but just come out and say, I know this and I know that and so on, are likely to be called dogmatists, and this is a very dirty word indeed in philosophical circles. And all the dangers that go with claiming to know anything are greatly magnified when what is claimed to be known is what the logicians call a universal negative. That is, a proposition of the form, there is no such thing as a so-and-so. How, for instance, would I go about establishing that there's no such thing as a seven-toed warthog? I don't think there is any such thing as a seven-toed warthog. And suppose I was the world's greatest warthog specialist, and I had examined thousands and thousands of warthogs and counted all their toes, and never came across one with 7 toes. Nevertheless, could I be justified in saying that there isn't and never has been and never will be one, not just one? I think you can see why, if I did, I would toss and turn through many a sleepless night. Because no matter what I do, there's always this danger that the next morning my worst enemy among warthogologists is going to come into my lab and unwrap this bundle, and there it is, the 7-toed warthog. All he has to do is come up with one single specimen, and his triumph is complete. It's all over. He doesn't have ever to lose a moment's sleep. He can go on to something else. But the defender of the universal negative, you see how nervous he has got to be, and how unendingly so. So, am I not very foolhardy in agreeing to undertake to defend this universal negative proposition? There is not, never was, and never will be such a thing as the God of the New Testament, etc. I dare say that many of you this very moment are recalling the beginning of Psalm 53. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God, and nodding your heads either outwardly or inwardly. But wait a moment. There is one exception to this difficulty about proving or knowing a universal negative. I'll illustrate this. I know and you know, and there's no least cause for nervousness in saying that we know it, that there is no such thing as a married bachelor or a four-sided triangle. In fact, these are specimens of what I might call lazy man's knowledge. Because what you have to do to know that there are no married bachelors or four-sided triangles, you don't have to go out into the field, as they say, and conduct laborious investigations, make surveys, have people fill out questionnaires. Are you a bachelor? Checkbox. Are you married? Checkbox. Anything like that, and put it through the IBM machines or anything. Because all you have to know is the English language. Bachelor means unmarried man. So, if someone were a married bachelor, he would be at one and the same time, and in the same respect, both married and unmarried. And this is what logicians call a contradiction, or a self-contradiction. And a contradiction can't be so. Not because God forbids contradictions to be so, and there's a great law fixed, thou shalt not make a contradiction true, or anything like that. Or because it takes too much effort or expense to make it true, or anything like that. It's just because, for a simple and rather trivial reason, that to say of anything that it has a certain property, and then also say that it doesn't have that very same property, is to say something and then immediately deny it. And so you wind up not having said anything. So much for the married bachelor. The four-sided triangle is a little bit, but I think perhaps importantly in this context, a little different. The word triangle, to be sure, doesn't mean three-sided figure. It means three-angled figure, as you can easily see. But it's easy for geometricians to prove that anything that has a straight-sided closed figure, at any rate, that has three angles must have three sides, neither more nor less. So, you can fuss with this and niggle with it even further. You can say this has three sides, doesn't directly contradict this has four sides, but if we are granted an additional assumption, we can derive a contradiction. And that additional assumption is one that I think everyone would grant. It's just that whatever has just three sides doesn't have also four sides. Oh, thank you. All right, well, I'll go on from there later. Fortunately, I'm afraid of running out of things, but I guess I'll be able to go on a little while longer. Thank you very much for your patience.
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid I must confess that I do not believe I have a great deal to reply to in this first speech. No doubt Dr. Matson will get on to his task with a little more vigor just a little later. And I just want to say very briefly, I'm glad to be here and I'm thankful for everybody that had a part in it. But I have too much to say to spend much time with going on into that in detail. I'd like to look first of all at chart number 78A3. Dr. Matson will have access to this projector. We have provided him with acetate material he can draw on and make charts, and it's available to him just as it is to me. I want to show you that Dr. Matson has obligated himself, as he was talking at the very end of his speech, to demonstrate that he knows that God does not exist. Now, I rather suspect that he was in the throes of beginning to tell us that no does not really mean no. But developments along that line shall await a further speech. But at any rate, he has signed the proposition, I know that God, that is, the God of the New Testament, who shall punish some eternally in hell, does not exist. This places him in a prison, I submit to you, from which he cannot escape. I want you to envision him. This is number 78A3. No, this is not the one I want. Number 78. Number 78. And then to be followed by number 78A. I want you to envision this as a building with a series of concentric rooms, the walls of which have no doors and no windows. Professor Matson is in the middle of it, right here. This first wall is the wall of the eternality of matter. Now, no one can know that God exists unless he knows that matter is eternal. He cannot get out of that room because he cannot prove that matter is eternal. The next wall is that life has come from non-living matter. I will show you later on that Dr. Matson is involved in a strenuous self-contradiction at that force, and he's already said tonight that one who's involved in self-contradiction holds a false proposition. He is already on record as saying that spontaneous generation does not occur. If it does not occur, then evolution does not occur, and if evolution does not occur, then atheism is false. Dr. Matson is under the obligation to show how to get out of this room, and he cannot do so. There are a number of other things that I will develop during the course of the debate, but I will let that do for the moment. Now to look at that one we had just a moment ago, 78A3, to show you the argument set out. If one is to know that there is no God, and I'm reading to you the meaning of these symbols, then he must know first that matter is eternal. He must know that life has come from non-living matter without any infinite force, intelligent or powerful force behind it, but merely non-living matter, rocks and dirt, if you will, and so on and on. Dr. Matson must prove that to prove his proposition. Now, I'll have a great deal more to say about that as time goes on. But I want to turn now to chart number 51A. I will not have time to say a great deal about each one of these, but I do want you to pay special attention to them, for we're talking about matters that are of great importance. The importance of this debate. While I greatly enjoy the preaching of the gospel and the defending of the existence of Almighty God, it is certainly not a matter of entertainment. There is no greater joy in the world than being a Christian, to being a servant of the Lord. But there's a great deal of difference between entertainment and simply enjoying a right relationship with God and with the Lord Jesus Christ. Notice carefully the importance of what we're about. If the atheistic view is true, then during our lives here on earth, we human beings are nothing but organized matter. Everything we are and do is a result of non-living, non-intelligent, non-purposive matter. There is, in the third place, no real objective right or wrong, good or evil. Dr. Matson, in answering the questions tonight, has labored very strenuously under the problem he faces at this point. For he does not wish to say that there is merely subjective evil. For he's on record as saying the one and only argument that he has to prove that God does not exist is the problem of evil. But if it is mere subjective evil, which follows as a clear implication of atheism, then one man's idea is just as good as another. And the truth of the matter is, if atheism implies subjectivism, which it does, and if subjectivism implies a logical contradiction, which it does, then atheism is false. Because if subjectivity implies a logical contradiction, then subjectivity is false. And if atheism implies subjectivity and subjectivity is false, that means that it simply is on the basis of feeling of each person. There is no objective reference. Then atheism is false. If atheism is true, no one has any real obligation to do or not to do anything. neither the Nazis nor the communists have really done anything wrong. Everything is permitted. There have been atheists who have faced up to the fact that apparently Dr. Matson is not going to be willing to face up to, that if atheism is true, if indeed there is no God, then everything, from stomping a child's head, from killing anybody you wish, to whatever kind of heinous crime you may envision. On the other hand, and in the next place, physical death is the end of us. Our total being goes to dust at death. There will be no accounting, no matter what we do with our lives on earth. Our lives on earth are of no significance whatever. But on the other hand, if the theistic view is true, then our Creator is God. There is an objective reference by which to measure or evaluate human behavior, and each of us will live on as a unique center of personality after earthly life is over. And each of us must give an account to God for how he has lived during earthly life. Let us look at 51C, crucial things to do in this debate. Jackie Steersman has already pointed out that the affirmative speaker has the obligation of proving his case. It is not my job presently to prove that I know that God exists. It is my responsibility to listen to Dr. Matson and see what he presents, to see if he can show that he knows that God does not exist. This problem of God is the fundamental, crucial problem which faces each and every human being. This is 51B, I'm sorry. 51C, the obligation of the affirmative speaker and the negative speaker. The affirmative speaker has the obligation of the burden of proving his own affirmative. He must present an argument. It must be a valid argument, and it must have true premises. This is what you must look for. And this is not a thing that's strange to Dr. Matson. He knows all about this kind of thing. Therefore, we will be looking for this argument. And then he must reply to negative material. He must clearly define his terms. When in the negative, we are to reply to the affirmative material and to present counter or negative material, which I shall do in these 2 nights. As to general matters, to call attention to any unsound arguments used by opponents, to call attention to self-contradictions, to absurdities, inconsistencies, and failures of responsibility, and so on. Now, chart number 51D. I want to raise the question with Dr. Matson. Is he going to be an atheist or an agnostic? In reading his book before this debate, I thought, well, he surely must be an agnostic. But then, lo and behold, he signed the proposition, I know that God does not exist. Now, Dr. Anthony Flew, in a spirit of honesty at one point in our discussion in Denton, Texas, about 2 years ago, said, I confess that I have a great deal of difficulty at this point. But so long as one is having difficulty at this point, if he has not decided whether he is an atheist or an agnostic, I do not see how he can sign the proposition, I know that God does not exist. Dr. Matson, you are faced with the possibility or with the dilemma of either rejecting your book, which is a part of a series published by Cornell University Press, or the proposition which you have espoused in this debate. Which one will it be? Now, what I must do in order to prove his proposition is false, chart number 70A. There are some things which Dr. Matson must know in order to prove that his proposition is true. I have suggested that very briefly with the reference to the atheist prison. His proposition and the total position which it involves him in self-contradiction. If I show that there are some things he must know, that he absolutely must know but cannot know, then he cannot prove his proposition. If I show that his proposition involves him in self-contradiction, as he has already admitted even here tonight, then his proposition is false. If I can show his proposition involves or implies a logical contradiction, then it's false. If I show his proposition involves him in the denial of major undisputed facts, I show that his proposition is false. If I show his efforts to defend his basic position involve him, at least by implication, in admissions of defeat, I have shown his proposition false. Or if his proposition involves him in the espousal of absurdities, or if his argument is unsound. So now let us proceed to admissions of defeat by Dr. Matson already before this debate began. Let us look at chart number 4A. We'll have 4A, 4H, 4L, and 4M in that order. 4A, the atheist's admissions of defeat in regard to his proposition. Now notice carefully, all of these statements from his book, The Existence of God, relate very strongly to the proposition which he has signed in this debate. This statement from pages 118 and 119, a creation out of nothing by the infinite being, if you like, is a hypothesis that cannot be ruled out by the physical evidence presently available. In other words, there is a clear admission that for all he knows, God may exist. Now, Dr. Matson, you can just as well give up. The debate is over. You have admitted, unless you are willing to say to Cornell University Press that the book you have published is simply not doing the job that it has claimed to do. Secondly, then Pasteur showed conclusively that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation. All living things are generated from seed. In other words, there has never been a case where life came from that which had no life. But given atheism, you have to start, if indeed you're going to start at all, with non-living matter. But you've got to get life in the picture because life is here now. But here he admits that there is never any life without seed. This is clearly an admission of defeat. Third, he, the writer, freely admits and insists on the possibility that he may have overlooked the telling bit of evidence, the absolutely conclusive argument, somewhere in the line. Some logical howler may have been committed that invalidates everything. In other words, he's saying, after having written all of this, well, it's just possible that I've made some logical blunder that really would indicate, if I found the truth about it, that God really does exist after all. I wonder, how could one give up more plainly, cleanly, and conclusively a discussion, a proposition, than as Dr. Matson in that statement? Number 4, of course, there may be some vitiating error in the argumentation of this part. Now that's in part 3 on evil, pages 135 to 170 in The Existence of God. That statement's on page 170. Now on page 135, Dr. Matson says, there is only one argument that can provide a positive ground for proving that God does not exist. Only one. But then when he gets to the end of that discussion, he says, but after all, this may be all wrong. Now if you have only one argument, let's look at chart 4L. Chart 4L. Dr. Matson admits defeat in regard to his only argument. Now he may say a lot of things. I personally already, though I've known him only a few minutes, have the feeling that if we got to be acquainted well, I would like him a great deal. But he's already in this brief while he said very little pertinent to the proposition, has admitted defeat in his book and has carried over to it by admission of the affirmation of logical contradiction is an admission of defeat. Matson admits in regard to his argument from evil that there is only one positive argument to prove there is no God. Secondly, that if that one argument will not do it, it cannot be done. Page 135. That one argument will not do it. Page 170. Now let's look at chart 4M. Here is an unget-overable dilemma for Professor Matson. In his book, The Existence of God, he admits by implication that the proposition which he assigned for this debate is false. By the proposition he assigned for this debate, by implication, he has branded some crucial positions set out in his book, The Existence of God, as false. You see, the proposition he assigned for this debate says, I know God does not exist. I have already given you proof that over and over he admits that he may be wrong about saying that. So he faces this dilemma, to reject his book or to reject his proposition in this debate. Now, Dr. Matson, you may call for this chart. It's number 4M, and I'd like you to take a pen and check one of these boxes here. reject either your book or your proposition in this debate. All right, now I want to give, in just a few moments left, some attention to the answers which he gave to the questions which I asked him. Number one, I, Wallace Matson, know that evil which warrants the deduction that God does not exist is check all appropriate boxes. Now, I had a number of boxes here. Let's put 86A on so the audience can see what we have done here. Now, he passes up, notice, all of these statements in violation. He is leaving us now with the impression that evil has nothing whatever to do with violation of any sort of law. But he answers right down here, something else explained. He says, pointless suffering. I don't think the word violation is appropriate. That's his answer. Actually, this is a dodge of this question. It is a failure to face up to its significance. There is no atheist, to my mind, that I've ever talked with at all in various universities that I've attended in various capacities, who have ever been willing to say, look, I don't care just what you do, other than the man that I indicated a few moments ago that everything is permitted, though he himself doesn't believe it, just like David Hume didn't really believe his philosophy. No atheist really deep down believes the implications of his doctrine. Now, Dr. Matson, I want to ask you, you have said pointless suffering. Is there then some suffering that has point to it? All right, there is suffering that has point to it. I want him to explain what it is that gives point to suffering. You see, in answering another question, he has said that God cannot inflict any sort of punishment, not even for one moment, not for 1 minute. That would be absolutely pointless suffering. For God to punish a man who has lived his life in willful, blasphemous disobedience. But there is some sort of suffering that has point to it. But all of the evil of the German Nazis in the effort to destroy the Jews was not a violation of any law at all. To my mind, this is one of the most absurd answers that I have ever heard. Now, secondly, let us look at charts 22B, 22C, 22D, 22F, and 22G as we can get to them. Question number 2, I, Wallace Matson, know that the evil which warrants a deduction that God does not exist is. Notice that he checks all. No, we need the chart 22. Yes, right, 22B. I needed first, though, 86A back up there. I wanted them to see the answers. I'm sorry. I got it away too soon. 86A. Well, we'll just go ahead with this one then. Notice he did not check the first point and he did not check the second one. I know that evil which warrants a deduction that God does not exist is. Notice he denies that it is mere subjective evil. Now you see there are some men who say that adultery is wrong, others say it's right. Now Dr. Matson says you cannot both be right. There is some sort of objective reference to which you must appeal in order to decide which one of you is right. Now that's going to be very interesting, isn't it? I'm going to be very interested to know just how Dr. Matson is going to fix that. How did Dr. Matson decide that all of these things here are wrong? Something done by a non-living thing is evil. A boulder rolling down a hill is evil. But a man violating a law is not evil. Isn't that strange? We'll be waiting to hear that explanation.
Well, I have to admit that my introductory remarks were a bit long-winded. And so I led Dr. Warren into the temptation of jumping the gun. I'll have to postpone my replies to most of what he said until it comes up in a more natural order. But he had to, by the rules of this debate, which make it these arbitrary 20-minute periods imposed on us, it's true that he had to say something, and so he brings out these charts. I was really disappointed at first because so many of them were familiar from the flu Warren book, and I thought that perhaps my colleague Tony Flew had educated him about these matters, but apparently not. I see, however, that he has prepared some specially for me. But let me set his mind at rest about a few things. He's worried that I'm going to waffle on atheism and turn into an agnostic, and hence sort of abandon the proposition that I've set my name to. Don't worry about that, Dr. Warren. I'm not going to do so. I did say something about Spinozism, and maybe that isn't quite atheism in all respects. But with respect to the God here under discussion, I say it emphatically, and I'm not going to abandon this unless Dr. Warren convinces me that I ought to, as a reasonable person. I'm not going to abandon the position that the God of the New Testament, who condemns some individuals to eternal punishment in hell, does not exist. Dr. Warren, I'm afraid, didn't listen to my remarks. I did say some things, and one of the things that I said, and if it was wrong, he should have shown me that it was wrong, one of the things I said was that this proposition was not discussed in my book. That is the proposition of tonight. The proposition discussed in my book is, does a being who is perfectly or infinitely powerful, knowledgeable, and good exist? And that's the one where I said there's a conclusive reason, at least it seemed conclusive to me, to reject this. But I said I might possibly be wrong and so on. I'm sorry that these very modest expressions of mine, I was only trying to be properly philosophically humble, have been said to be a cop-out. I didn't intend them as such. But we're talking about something different tonight. There is nothing in the book about punishing some individuals eternally in hell. That makes all the difference. I can assert that that being does not exist, cannot exist, couldn't possibly exist. I cannot possibly be mistaken about it. So if that's the kind of dogmatism that Dr. Warren wants me to espouse, well, he is welcome to it. I will do it. I will come to these matters before. On that issue, I am a complete atheist, and I'm not apologizing, retreating, hedging, waffling, or anything. Is that perfectly clear? I hope. On other matters, let me get back to the modest expressions in my book. You know, Oliver Cromwell engaged in a theological discussion with some other sect of Protestantism at one time, made this famous remark: "Brethren, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, bethink yourselves, you may be wrong." Well, that's always made a powerful impression on me, and I do try to keep it before me. But sometimes I answer it no. I have considered in the bowels of Christ whether I could be wrong about this one, and I'm not. Okay? Now let me give some more meat to Dr. Warren to chew on. Let's see. I was talking when I had to stop about showing that a universal negative involves a contradiction and how this can be done, and you don't get yourself into the usual binds that beset universal negatives. That was just one example of logic, which many people find boring, but it is useful. If there were no logic, there wouldn't be any computers, and wouldn't that be a terrible thing? I think that logic, and I think Dr. Warren agrees with me, at least verbally on this, that logic has some uses in philosophical theological debates, though, like all fine tools, it needs to be used with care and in an appropriate manner. Remember what I've already called attention to, that I'm a professor of philosophy and I'm visiting Cambridge, don't add up, as a simple-minded logician might think they did, to I'm the visiting professor of philosophy at Cambridge. But now let's get back to the proposition there's no such thing as a supernatural person. I'm leaving out for the moment the business about perfection and about punishing in hell, just a supernatural person. This universal negative, there's no such thing as a supernatural person. That is rather like there's no such thing as a seven-toed warthog, I think. And I would have been unenthusiastic about that as a subject for debate. And if I were forced to debate it, I would at least have insisted on the privilege of the negative to come last and of being able to put the burden of proof on the party maintaining that such a being does exist. Dr. Warren, I am sorry to say, has already made an attempt tonight to shift the burden of proof. He has said that if I can't carry through what I said in my book as the one positive argument for the non-existence of God, if I can't make that stick, then I've given up my position. Not by any means. The burden of proof in a question like this, like on the question of the existence of any old God, is naturally, by convention and in the nature of things too, on the affirmative. This is a point that Anthony Flew made at some length in these previous debates, but I'm afraid they didn't quite get across, namely the presumption of atheism. The atheist triumphs if he can show that there's something wrong with all the arguments of the theist, even if the atheist himself can bring forward no conclusive positive argument. However, we're not going to be in that bind because I do have conclusive positive arguments on the issue before us, which, I repeat, is not there's no such thing as a supernatural person, but rather there is no such thing as the God of the New Testament who is to punish some individuals eternally in hell. That resembles there is no such thing as a four-sided triangle. That is to say, what I am maintaining is that Dr. Warren's God is a self-contradictory being, like a four-sided triangle, and therefore can't possibly exist. In fact, I shall maintain this God is a doubly self-contradictory being, a really grotesque logical monster. So, my knowledge that this being does not exist is no big deal. It's what I've already called lazy man's knowledge. To know that this is so, I don't have to find out anything about how the world is, or what happens after I die, or its origin, or whether living matter came from non-living matter, or whether a monkey mother had a human child, or anything like that. All I need to attend to is the meaning of a few English words, such as individual and punish and hell and good. And if I was long-winded before, I'll try to make up for it now. One thing, though, that does make me a little bit anxious is the fact that these debates are to go on for 4 nights. The hall is hired, the audio tape and the videotape people are all here, and the court reporters are engaged. Somebody is counting on 4 nights' work, sweeping up after us and all that. And I don't know whether I can spin out what I have to say for that long. I may wind up conceding my surplus time to Dr. Warren. I hope words will not fail him. As for myself, I can present my arguments very quickly, and I shall do so in a moment. First, though, I think it might be a good idea to establish something that I'm sure Dr. Warren and I agree on. Namely, it's implied in the proposition we're debating, namely that the New Testament does, as a matter of fact, plainly, emphatically, and repeatedly threaten eternal punishment in hell. I would add that the punishment threatened is, or at least includes, being burned, literally being burned in literal fire or something awfully like it. Dr. Warren, I think, hedged just a little bit on this. One of the questions I asked him was this: do you hold that the punishment of individuals in hell is, or at least includes, pain of the kind that we here on earth feel when fire is applied to our bodies? His reply was, it conveys the idea of the intensity of it. Well, I'll take that as agreement. Now, I don't mean oxidized, consumed, or cremated, as indeed happens when we are burnt, rather mercifully, but a process involving the pain that accompanies that kind of chemical alteration. Now, I say this is preached in the New Testament. The principal passage on it is the passage on the Last Judgment at the conclusion of Matthew chapter 25, from which I quote briefly. Verse 41, quote, "Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." And verse 46, quote, "And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal," end quote. Note that in this final verse, heaven and hell are put on an exactly equal footing. Now this, and no one will disagree with this is one of the solemnest pronouncements of our Lord Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, there have been attempts made, especially since the 17th century, to get around the plain sense of this passage. They mostly hinge on the claim that the Greek word that's here translated as eternal, namely aionion, really means, or at least can mean, not eternal, but just age-long or indefinitely long. But since I'm sure that Dr. Warren is as scornful of such evasions as I am, they need not detain us. I quoted the principal passage. In a hasty survey, I counted in the 3 synoptic Gospels 17 mentions of hellfire. To be sure, many of them are duplications. And 7 more mentions of just plain hell. Though I found only 2 mentions in the so much less bloodthirsty Gospel according to St. John. I think it's noteworthy that except for the worm, which dieth not, and wailing and gnashing of teeth, nothing is said about hell, but that it is a place of fire, and it is eternal. So the New Testament certainly does teach hellfire. In fact, I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that it's one of the main themes of the New Testament, on a par with such matters as the wickedness of scribes and Pharisees and the fact that Jesus over and over repeats that he will come again in glory during the lifetime of people then living. Well, so hell exists, and if you get there, you're burned. Is it populated? There's another evasion. The cardinal, no less, I'm told, I don't know his name, the cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church is supposed to have said, when backed into a corner about hell, "I believe in an eternal hell, eternally vacant." But I think that is a hedge and does not have scriptural authority, in fact contradicts it. Hell is populated, or will be. In general terms, we're told it is populated by the wicked and those who do iniquity. More specifically, we're told it's populated by those who are angry with their brothers without a cause, Matthew 5. The uncharitable, Matthew 25. Jews, Matthew 27, and St. John, most all the way through. Blasphemers against the Holy Ghost, Mark 3 and many other places. That, I guess, is a specific count, though it's not clear, at least to me in my ignorance, what constitutes the offense. And all those who believe not, Mark 16 and throughout St. John. Also rich men. At least they have an awful time escaping it, we're told. There seems, as I read the New Testament, to be some uncertainty about whether hell exists right now. That is, whether individuals are suffering in it right now at this very moment while we're talking. Or whether it will receive its inhabitants only after the second coming and last judgment. There are various passages that seem to me at least to say both these things. I leave it to Dr. Warren to resolve this issue if he chooses to do so. I don't think it matters for the general argument that I shall present. Well, I guess I'm being long-winded again, but I thought I should bring these matters about hell up because of the evident lack of interest in hell at least where I come from, the godless city of Berkeley. When I went to research this matter at our university library, I found that almost all the books on hell were very old and in storage. That is to say, there's not room in our library for all the books on the shelves, so those that very rarely circulate are put in storage and you have to order them specially. Well, that was the case with the whole shelf on hell, which is terrible if hell does exist, because then it's a far more horrendous fact than the H-bomb or anything else. Indeed, the writers on hell constantly say that the worst thing that can happen to you in this life is, they constantly recur to this metaphor, like a flea bite compared to the least pain of hell. Well, as I say, this ought to be brought up. Now, as you probably will not surprise you, I reject this whole business as both incredible and repulsive. However, I respect Christians like Dr. Warren and your local heroine, Anita Bryant, who accept all of it. The people I cannot respect, and their name is legion, are those who no more believe this stuff than I do, but nevertheless claim to be Christians and puff themselves up for being it. I don't know whether our Lord Jesus Christ ever said, "Thou shalt not have it both ways," but it would be an admirable text to find somewhere or other. Well, with these preliminaries out of the way, in the 3 minutes I have, I think I can give you my two arguments. I say, the assertion that God, a being who is going to punish some individuals eternally in hell, exists, is doubly self-contradictory. All right, here are the contradictions and the arguments. Contradiction 1. This one is perfectly general. It applies to any kind of God or indeed any being whatsoever. I say, God can't punish me after my death because I won't be around. I will have ceased to exist. That's what death is, the cessation of the individual's existence. It's obviously a contradiction to say of anything X, both that X doesn't exist at time t and that X is being punished at time t. And God, as Dr. Warren and all reasonable people admit, or indeed insist, God can't bring about a contradiction. Got that? Okay, that's one argument. Here's the second one. Contradiction 2. This is more restricted. It applies only to Dr. Warren's God, who has, among other desirable traits, that of being perfectly good. But it is a contradiction to say of anything X, both that X is perfectly good, or indeed good at all, and also X wills and brings about the infliction of eternal torment on some sentient individual Y. Well, there, I'm finished. Since both these arguments that I just given are obviously logically valid and have true premises, and since either one is by itself sufficient to establish the knowledge, this lazy man's knowledge that I claim to have in the proposition to which I assented, the reasonable thing for me to do is to go on back to Berkeley, I suppose, and get on with something else. Or if it's felt that all these arrangements and so forth that have been made, it's up to us to find something to talk about through Thursday, I'll ask Dr. Warren whether he has any suggestions. And I think I have something like 52 seconds left, but I will yield those to Dr. Warren.
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm certainly happy to be back before you for the second speech of the evening. And I'd like to begin this part by going over Dr. Matson's efforts thus far and showing you as kindly as I know how to do so, and yet with as much force because of the importance of the matters with which we're dealing, the blunders and errors in which he has involved himself. First of all, I'd like to suggest to you the significance of the fact that he did not look at a single one of the many charts which I presented for his consideration. It therefore means that he is not really paying the attention to the negative arguments that he ought to be and that he obligated himself to do in this discussion. Secondly, he blundered by claiming that the burden is not on me, but on him. And he cited Dr. Anthony Fleur's book, The Presumption of Atheism, as an effort, or in an effort, to prove that that's where the burden of proof lies. The truth of the matter is, Dr. Fleur knows as well as I do that the burden of proof lies upon the affirmative. And it really is a surprise to me that Dr. Matson would come here and say that the burden of proof is on me, not on him. He affirmed the proposition, I know that God does not exist. It is not my responsibility these 2 nights to prove that God does. He's suffering before the time, before Wednesday and Thursday night, when I will be under the obligation to prove the existence of God. It is now his responsibility to prove that he knows that God does not exist. Third, he claimed that he didn't need to know anything about the world. Well, Dr. Matson, if there'd ever been a moment that there was nothing existing, there wouldn't be anything existing now. So you've got to know the world exists eternally. And since there is now life, and life did not exist eternally, and since you have admitted in your book that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation, that no life comes except from seed, you are now facing an unget-overable proposition. You are in that prison, you are in a room from which you cannot escape. Fourth, he claimed he didn't need to know about the origin of human life. And yet, in these questions, when I asked him on 9 and 10, if the first human being originated by being born of something non-human, he said no, by failing to answer in the way that I indicated. If he left the box blank, would give a false answer. And he said that no human being owes its origin to being transformed from something that already existed and then turned into a human being. These are the only 2 possibilities. He therefore admits that no human being owes his origin to evolution. Now, if no human being owes his origin to evolution, and the only way atheism can be true is that evolution is true, it is therefore clear that atheism is not true. And his effort to try to prove his whole case by an alleged conflict in the concept of God simply falls of its own weight. He claimed that he did not need to, or in the 6th place, he admitted that an infinite good God may exist. When I pointed out that in his book he admitted that for all he knew, God may have created man, and I pointed out that he needed to give up either his proposition in this debate or to give up that book, he said, no, I don't have to do that because I was talking about a good God. But now note the significance of this. He is admitting that for all he knows, an infinite good God may exist. The only problem he has with it is that he can't see that a good God could punish anybody even for one moment, much less for eternity. We'll have more to say about that with some charts later on. Dr. Matson, I hope the significance of that admission is really sinking in upon you. We are here tonight concerned about your soul. I am not here, I assure you, to merely win an argument or to try to be clever or to say something cute. I am concerned about you. We are human beings facing an eternity. And the fact, as you have claimed, that there is a contradiction between a man dying and God punishing is simply overlooking the fact that the God of the Bible says that the soul of man does not die when the body dies. Jesus himself said in Matthew 10:28, be not afraid of him that can kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but fear him that's able to destroy both body and soul in hell. Now, Dr. Matson, the soul does not die when the body dies, and you should have quoted that along with all the other passages that you used. There is no contradiction to your first alleged contradiction, and there is no contradiction to your second alleged contradiction, because God is just as infinite in holiness, righteousness, and justice as he is in love and goodness. If God could tolerate sin, he would not be a God that I could worship. Dr. Matson has called God grotesque and monstrous. But I say that if God claimed to be good, while he would tolerate evil, while he would tolerate a man who would live his life in the blasphemous statements that Dr. Matson has made, and then simply say that nothing had happened and pay no attention to it, or to live his life as Adolf Hitler, with all the terrible monstrosities of the Nazis and of the communists in their efforts, of the murderous efforts for genocide, to try to destroy the Jews, then I would say that God would not be worthy of worship. But God is just as infinite in justice and holiness and righteousness, meaning that he cannot tolerate sin, as he is in love and goodness. Dr. Matson claims to know merely from the concept of God that God does not exist, but he falls far short on it. He claims that God punishing constitutes a contradiction, and I've indicated that that does not stand. I urged him in the answer to one of the questions that he explain what he means by pointless suffering and what suffering with point to it would mean, and he paid no attention to it whatever. Notice that by his arguments he has opened the door to the Nazis by way of saying that what they have done is not really objectively wrong. They claim that they were obeying the law of their own land. They were as fully convinced they were right as Dr. Matson is that he is right. What right would he have to have gone to Adolf Hitler and say, you are wrong, you are doing the wrong thing? Dr. Matson, will you please explain that to us? He keeps saying that he won't have much to say and that we probably won't have enough to say for 4 nights. Dr. Matson, you're almost convincing me, as I listen to your speeches, that I assure you there is enough, far more than for 4 nights, but for much more than that. He claims that God cannot be perfectly good and punished for even one moment, but he admitted that God may have created man, but thinks it's ridiculous that God could raise him from the dead. Notice in his book, I pointed out to you the admission that he said that for all he knows, God may have created man. But he says it's ridiculous to think that man could survive death, that God could raise him from the dead, or that God could cause his soul to survive death. I want now to look at the charts on punishment, charts which I have indicated to you. Chart 84A will be followed that by 84B and then 84C and D and so on. Now, Dr. Matson, this is chart number 84A. I raised the question, how does the atheist know about eternal punishment? In order for the atheist to know that God does not exist, he must know there will be no eternal punishment. Dr. Matson claims to know that. I wanted to explain exactly how he knows. He's claiming to know what is going to be over on the other side of physical death. Secondly, how does the atheist claim to know this to be the case? Third, let the atheist check all of the correct answers below. By deduction from the concept of God, by deduction from the concept of evil, by deduction from the concept of sin, by deduction from the concept of man, by deduction from the empirical fact of pain and or suffering, or by deduction from the empirical fact that matter is eternal. We need to know what he says about that, or is it something else that we have not listed? Incidentally, he complained a bit about my using some of the charts that I had used with Dr. Flew. Well, Dr. Matson, I thought they worked so well with him that I just saved them over for you. There are just some more things and some questions that Dr. Flew had and answered that are also going to be used, and there are more charts. There's no reason to change it when you have the truth. 84B, the infinite love and the infinite justice of God are compatible. Now here is really all he has said. This is everything about it. He's going to ignore his responsibility about the eternality of matter, about life coming from non-life, about human life coming from non-human life, in spite of the fact of the statements that he's made, all to the contrary, that no life comes from something that isn't seed. He's going to ignore all of that and base all of his case on this. But notice, the infinite love and justice of God are compatible with at least 1 minute of punishment. He says, no, it isn't. With at least 1 minute of punishment for sin after one's or during life is sin. If God did exist, and if he committed sin, would it be right, would it fit with the justice and the love of God for God to punish him even 1 moment? Is any punishment at all for anything? There's a man who took 7 nurses, one at a time, and executed them. As the Nazis put the Jews in the gas chambers, when they put them in boxcars fixed with quicklime and died a horrible death. Were they worthy of any punishment whatever, even a slap on the wrist? Those who are now catching little girls, 8, 9, and 10 years of age, beating them, drugging them, and forcing them into prostitution. Dr. Matson, are they deserving of even 1 minute, 1 moment of any sort of punishment? All right, let's go on to the next one. 84C. I'd like for Dr. Matson to tell us, I know that it's possible the infinite justice of God might entail after this earthly life is over at least 1 month and so on. He has already answered this by saying absolutely none at all. He knows that the character of God is such that, or the goodness of God is such that it simply rules out any punishment whatever. Now, how does Matson know what the punishment for sin should be? Now, we're talking about the existence of God. Granted, even for him it's a counterfactual hypothesis. He doesn't believe it. But if God would exist, how would he know what the punishment for sin should be? By intuition, by deduction from the concept of God, by deduction from the concept of sin, by deduction from empirical fact, by deduction from the combination of the concept of God, from something else. What? He needs to tell us how he decided it. It's got to be something more than assertion. Let's go on to the degrees of punishment and reward. 84F. The Bible makes clear that God is a just God and that he will punish man according to his works. Why degrees of reward and punishment? Because it is just, because it's biblical. It is just. Human laws recognize that some crimes are deserving of more punishment than other crimes. One who commits a crime of passion does not receive as much of the type of punishment that one does who commits a premeditated crime. Human laws recognize that a small child who steals a box of candy is not punished as a man who rapes and murders an 8-year-old child. If human laws drafted by men with their human weaknesses and faults make a distinction as to punishment, then how much more is the perfect lawgiver and judge of all the earth, God, able to recognize degrees not only of punishment, but also of reward. It is biblical. Here are passages showing that, but I'll not take the time to go into that detail. Now let us turn to the charts on evil. Charts 36, beginning with chart number 36. Notice that he has said there is one and only one argument offered as a positive reason for believing that God does not exist, and that is that his existence is incompatible with the imperfections of the world. That argument is that if an infinite and perfect being exists, then whatever else exists must be compatible with his will. Only the existence of perfection is compatible with the will of a perfect being. The world is not perfect, therefore an infinite and perfect being does not exist. Now I will show you as we proceed that there's something wrong with this argument. But right now I want us to look at chart 18J and K to look at the concept of God. Now as we look at the concept of God, it is a certain misappropriation of biblical teaching to simply pick out one point, let us say goodness, love, and mercy, and neglect the fact of the power of God, of the justice and righteousness and holiness of God. There is such a thing as retribution. The Bible teaches, and let us look, incidentally, be getting ready for the next chart on the chart on the admission of defeat in regard to punishment. You may find that, Brother Deaver, if you will, please. Now notice, when only God exists, again I know this is counterfactual for Dr. Matson, but now suppose that nothing but God exists before the creation of the world. He cannot then argue that something is evil in the world and God is incompatible with that. Here now, simply looking at the concept of God, which is really what he's been arguing, he has to prove that the goodness of God is incompatible with the justice and righteousness of God. God is holy, righteous, and cannot tolerate evil. Therefore, there is no contradiction, as Dr. Matson has alleged, in God punishing man for his wrong. In fact, it would be otherwise if he were not to punish man. Now I want to notice, in regard to his point on chart number 4G, that there is no responsibility upon his part to prove the origin of man. 4G. If the theory of evolution is false, then atheism is false. The theory of evolution is false. Dr. Matson has admitted it in his answers to the questions, and therefore, that is in regarding the matter of spontaneous generation, and therefore it follows that atheism is false. My friends, it's the case that we are here either by creation or by evolution. It cannot be both. It must be one or the other. They exhaust the possibility. If it is by creation, then God exists. If it is by evolution, then man was either born of something that was non-human, or he was transformed from something that was non-human. Dr. Matson himself has admitted that both of those are false. It is false that man has been born of something non-human. It is false that man has been transformed from something that is non-human. Putting those two together, it is therefore clear that it is false that man was either born or transformed from something non-human. Therefore, it follows that evolution is false. Now, going back to our original proposition that we are here either by creation or by evolution, since we have shown that evolution is false, it therefore follows that creation is true by disjunctive syllogism. Dr. Matson has indicated the value of logic, and I insist upon it as well. And therefore I have shown that he does have the responsibility of facing up to the eternality of matter, to the origin of life, to the origin of human life, and some of the marvelous and wonderful things about the human life. All right, 2 minutes. Now I want us to look at charts 68L, M, N, and L, M, and N in the closing moments of our study. 84K. All right, 84K. All right. Atheist admits defeat, and I mean by that Dr. Matson, in regard to eternal punishment. If the atheist grants that God, who is infinite in justice, can justly punish a wicked man for some length of time, say X, after this life is over, oh, I'm sorry, that is not the chart that I wanted. Let's go to 68L. All right. What law did the Nazis violate? True or false? In torturing and murdering 6 million Jews, Jewish men, women, and children, the Nazis were guilty of real objective moral wrong. Is that true or false? In doing so, the Nazis really did deserve to be accused, tried, found guilty, and punished by the authorities of Great Britain, United States of America, and others. The Nazis did real objective wrong because they violated only Nazi law, the law of England, and so on. I want him to tell us what they did, or what it was in the entire case that made it wrong, if indeed it was wrong. Notice the defense of the Nazis we were in our own nation, obeying our own law. We were not amenable to the law of Russia, of England, the United States. Therefore, your law had nothing whatever to do with us. Therefore, we did right. The Germans would say, the Nazis would say, we did right. The Jews would say, you did wrong. Is there no objective reference by which to decide it? If so, then all the punishment which they received was completely beside the point. And in fact, if there is no objective reference by which to evaluate human behavior, then there is nothing any more wrong with taking a sledgehammer and smashing the head of a child than of taking the same hammer and smashing a cockroach. Indeed, it's the case, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. And that's the position that Dr. Matson is upholding before you tonight.
I don't like to be captious, but I think that these debates in subsequent evenings would get on better if Dr. Warren would bring us fewer charts and more attention to the argument. He is very eager to get on to the questions of evolution and how an atheist can claim that anything is wrong, which I am perfectly willing to discuss. But as he has also insisted, these are my 2 nights to have the affirmative and to present my own case. And it seems to me that he ought to grant me the courtesy of letting me present this case and not continually complain about my not talking about everything all at once. I will, Dr. Warren. We have 4 nights. I'm not going to let you go away disappointed. I think I'll be able to deal with everything you're saying in those 4 nights, and if not, I will most certainly do it in person or by correspondence, if you so desire. I have to put in a denial about my admission that my case is fallen and so on and so forth. I did, I think, present some arguments a few minutes ago. There was very little attention paid to those. You will have noticed in what was just said. Perhaps Dr. Warren would like to think them over a while, or perhaps he wants them to be produced a little more slowly. Well, I'm quite willing to oblige. He did say, in regard to my first one, namely that I can't be punished after I'm dead because I'm gone and won't be there. Seems to me a rather good argument, but maybe not. He did say that I missed the whole point because it's the soul that matters and not the body. Well, let's see. I'd like to give this argument, if you like, in slow motion. So let me try to do that. After I die, my body will be burnt up or fed to the dogs or left in a coffin to decompose or something of this sort. In any event, it will, after more or less time, cease to be identifiable any longer as my body. Well, I mean, maybe not. Maybe I'll be preserved in rum or mummified or deep frozen. But I think we can disregard those possibilities, since any theory of the afterlife that works only for them couldn't be of much interest to us. I mean, unless your theory of the afterlife works for decomposed bodies, there's no use bringing it up. Well, but what will probably be said at this point, I think Dr. Warren already did say it, the body will decompose, but God can resurrect it. And indeed, Jesus and St. Paul expressly tell us that he does this. Rather briefly, though, well, the subject was considered with great care, as all religious questions were, by St. Thomas Aquinas. And he pointed out in his conclusion on the subject that no matter how thoroughly dispersed the ingredients may be that made up my body while I'm alive, God, who is all-knowing and all-powerful, can keep track of them and reassemble them. He says, I quote the saint directly, in the twinkling of an eye, end quote. Well, I'm not going to deny this. I'm not going to deny that omnipotence can do anything that's conceivable. And that reassembly job, I admit, is conceivable. What I deny, though, is that the reassembled body, even out of the original ingredients, would be me. It would be a replica of me, indistinguishable to sight from me. And I'll even allow, with all my present brain traces and all my memories, so that it never did. This replica never doubted that it was Matson. But that's not good enough. Well, why not? Well, look at it from my present point of view. I admit that God could make a perfect replica of me after I die. Well, but if he can do that, he can also make a perfect replica of me right now while I'm alive. Or if you like, 17 of them. Or, cloning and all that. But we'll suppose that God does it by supernatural means, out of nothing, if you like. Not only could this be done, but it's at least that possibility, for all I know, remember the universal negative, that there may be such unfortunate beings scattered around the galaxies right now. Perfect replicas of me, think they're Matsons, who are maybe making talks identical to this to audiences identical to this, so on, in the Andromeda galaxy or wherever. That's a supposition that a science fiction writer might have fun with. Suppose I discovered, that is, knew, and even Dr. Warren admitted that I knew, that it was true, that there was such a replica somewhere. What would that be to me here and now? It would be an interesting and astounding, if you like, piece of information. Nothing more. The distinction would still remain between me and them. I couldn't feel their pain. And they couldn't be justly punished for my transgressions. Doesn't matter how they might fool everybody by looking like me and thinking that they were me and so on. They wouldn't really be me. I hope that's quite clear. That's right here and now. All right, I say. God can make a replica of me out of whatever materials are lying about or out of nothing. But no such replica is me. Now, I don't think that anyone would deny this if he thought it over. That is, he wouldn't deny it if the materials that constitute this replica are different from the materials that constitute or constituted me. You know, I'm just talking about the body now. I'll come to the soul in a moment, so be impatient. But now, suppose that instead of making this replica out of, so to speak, the goods in the warehouse, God very carefully, as in St. Thomas Aquinas, God very carefully gathers up all the fragments that once were in me and makes a new so-called me out of them, just those and no others. Does that alter the case? Well, St. Thomas says it does. And indeed he claims that for the resurrection of the body that God promises, this must indeed happen. I hate to disagree with such an eminent authority, but on this matter I'm afraid I must. And I'll try to persuade you that one must disagree with him by the following means. Suppose I somehow know right now that a year after I die, some replica of me made of foreign material will be burned at the stake. I'll be sorry to hear this, but it won't terrify me the way it would terrify me if I knew that a year from now I'm not going to die, but keep right on living, and in 365 days I'm going to be burned at the stake. And I don't think it would you if you think it over. Because, why is this? Well, it's because once I'm dead, it makes no difference to me what happens to this matter that composes me now. It doesn't make any difference whether it's incinerated or eaten or left to decompose or whatnot. It's just like my hair cuttings and fingernail parings. Now, I'm well aware that there have been and are tribes who think it makes a great deal of difference what happens to their hair cuttings and fingernail parings, but I assume that it doesn't to anyone in this audience. Well, I think everything in the body is the same way. When we are through with it, that's the end of our interest in it. If the meat that I am now becomes a hyacinth or a rose or a bumstalker, what of it? Sorry to talk about such gruesome subjects, and I know lots of people do set great store on waterproof mausoleums and all that, but I must be frank here. I say, if a replica of me is made out of different material, it doesn't interest me. Well, I say, in a special case when the replica is made of my reconstituted fragments, that doesn't either. Why not? The case is no different. Continuity has been lost. That thing is an imposture. It's not me. I cease to exist. And having ceased to exist, I can't come back at all. So a replica of me, I admit, can. All right, so much for the body. If it convinces you, fine. If it doesn't, I'll have to rely on my second argument. But now let me go on to the soul. Dr. Warren says that I've missed the point. Because I am not a body, or at any rate I'm not just a body, I am a soul. Or at any rate the most important part of me is the soul. And this soul is what God is going to punish eternally in hell. And it survives death. So continuity isn't lost. Well, my full reply to that would take us deep into what philosophers call the mind-body problem, on which I have recently published a book, Plug. Right now, I'll just summarize my conclusions, somewhat dogmatically perhaps, and leave it to subsequent discussion. with Dr. Warren to clear up obscurities, if any. That is, if Dr. Warren sees fit to discuss my argument at all. I hope he will. To be brief about it, I would say that this objection fails. That is, the objection that it doesn't matter about the body because the soul will still be there. This fails because, at least with respect to what is dealt with in the matter of punishing and so on, the soul is identified with the person's conscience, sentience, feeling, awareness, or whatever it is that we've got going when we're awake and that shut down when we go to sleep. And what I claim is that this consciousness, this sentience, this awareness, is not a thing over and above and in addition to the body. It's not an extra organ, the body, sort of spiritual kidney, not even an immaterial extra organ. What is this consciousness? It just is the functioning of the body, or more particularly the functioning of the central nervous system. I didn't make this up, of course. The view I'm here expressing goes back to Aristotle and beyond. But it seems to me that modern science and philosophy needs no reasonable doubt about its adequacy and indeed truth. So to survive, suppose that the functioning of my body can go on when the body has been destroyed. That's to make a mistake. Like that of supposing that the melody can go on after the fiddle has been smashed, or the digestion can continue after the stomach, etc., have been all messed up. Moreover, another point, to take this from the philosopher Hume, suppose for a moment that what I just said isn't right. Suppose that thoughts, feelings, and so on can exist, or even do exist, so to speak, disembodied, just floating. That they can exist independently of a thinking, feeling, and so on body. Even so, as Hume pointed out, there could be no way in which what he calls the bundles of these thoughts, and so thoughts, etc., could be identified as being my thoughts, feelings, and so on as distinct from yours. There's no principle of identity that ties them all together and makes this my feeling as distinguished from your feeling if our bodies are gone. What makes my thoughts is there are the thoughts associated with my body. And when that's gone, there's no way of identifying them. The tag is lost. So, even on this hypothesis, namely the hypothesis that contrary to what I assert to be the case, there can be feelings independent of the body, all that God could do in the way of so-called punishment after death would be to create an eternal, say, burning sensation. God would say, let there be an eternal burning sensation. If he could do that, which I deny, he could, I suppose, associate that eternal burning sensation with an eternal, I used to be Matson belief. And so there is this sensation, which is a sensation of extreme discomfort that lasts eternally, and which is also somehow blended with the feeling, oh, Lordy, I used to be Matson, and now I'm getting it. Well, all right. On this hypothesis, I suppose that might be done. But that would be utterly pointless cruelty. This wouldn't in fact be Matson. It would be God being deceptive. And I'm sure Dr. Warren would not want to adhere to that blasphemy. Nor is that, please note this, nor is that possibility something that can frighten me here and now. Not because I'm particularly brave, but because one of the things I happen to know right here and now is that that sort of thing, if it existed, wouldn't be me. It would be like the replica of me in the Andromeda Galaxy. All right. That's what I had to say about that argument. I suppose I'd better go on now to say something about the second argument, although I'm afraid this may be going a little too fast for Dr. Warren. I had planned to reserve this, but let me see if I can say something about it. The second argument, remember, is this. that Dr. Warren's God, the God who is at one and the same time both perfectly powerful, knowing, and good, and also punishes souls eternally in hell, cannot exist, because that description contains a self-contradiction, namely the contradiction between being good and inflicting eternal torment on some sentient creature. Why do I say that's a contradiction? Well, isn't it? I mean, don't you see it? Let those who have eyes see, for those who have ears hear. But maybe I'd better try to, all I can do is, so to speak, try to dress this up rhetorically a little bit, and that's what I will try to do. Maybe I should begin by repeating. I think I've already made this point, but for Dr. Warren's benefit at least, I will repeat it. That this is a distinct argument from that I considered in the chapter on evil in my book, which I think Dr. Warren assumes that more of you have read than probably really have. Though I dare say that before the week is out, we will get substantially all of it in his charts. So you will have read it before you leave if you're faithful in your attendance. The argument I used in my book was the traditional argument that goes back at least to the philosopher Epicurus, that of the three traditional attributes of God, namely his perfect knowledge, his perfect power, and his perfect goodness, it's only possible, compatibly with the evil that exists in the world, for him to have two of them. Because if he is perfectly powerful and good, and evil exists, it must be because God doesn't know that it exists, in which case he isn't perfectly knowing. Or, if he's perfectly good and perfectly knowing and evil exists, it must exist because he can't prevent it. And then he's not all-powerful. But if he is perfectly powerful, can do anything he wants, and perfectly knowing, knows everything that's going on, and evil exists, it must be because he doesn't want to prevent it, and consequently isn't good. A very simple, in my opinion, conclusive argument. In fact, the only philosophical argument I know that I think I would award the title conclusive to, at least in my more skeptical moments, I think of that. I know Dr. Warren has written a whole book in reply to this argument, and I suppose we will discuss it in due time. That, however, is not the argument I am presenting now, and I want to make this clear. My argument is a distinct argument. It's true, I said about that argument that, well, maybe you can drive a wedge in somewhere. Though I didn't mean by that to give up the case, as Dr. Warren says I did. I just admit that I'm a fallible human being. I'm not the Pope. This argument is that a perfectly good, or indeed being that wasn't even just imperfectly good or good at all, could not will and carry out his will to inflict eternal torment on any sentient being, however wicked that was, because that's just the maximum of atrocity, the maximum of evil. Now, Dr. Warren talks about God's justice in this connection. Well, I haven't time now to go into that, but I will. Right now, I'm simply presenting the argument. I will try to deal with objections to it tomorrow night. Why is that? Well, for one thing, the eternity of it. It's to be sure, Dr. Warren tried to work a certain kind of philosophical ploy on me that's called, in ancient logic, the heap. That is, to ask, well, would 1 minute of punishment at post-mortem be just, and if two, and so on. And the idea is that where are you going to draw the line? If you admit that any punishment is okay, then you have to say that an infinite amount is. Well, I didn't fall for that. Nevertheless, I would say this. Granting, which I don't, but granting for the sake of argument, that some amount of punishment might be just for sins, I repeat, I do not grant this. I'm just saying this for the sake of argument. Everybody's more interested in that the punishment ought to fit the crime. But nobody, not even Hitler, not even Stalin, has done anything for which the only appropriate punishment is an eternity of being burned at the stake. Granted, maybe being burned at the stake once. Granted, maybe being burned at the stake 100 times. You do come to something to say. After all, Dr. Warren brought up the Old Testament. I didn't. The eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If Hitler had suffered 6 million deaths, you ought to stop there. And indeed, that's where I will stop for tonight.
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to me to be back before you for the third speech of the evening, the reply to the speech to which you've just listened. I want to call attention first to Dr. Matson's statement. He says Dr. Warren did not apparently listen to my speech very well, for he didn't answer it. I think you know better than that without my having to point it out to you, but let me just indicate that I did give a list of some 14 blunders, including a discussion of the only 2 things that he claimed to be arguments. Now, I do not know how one could reply to a speech any more than that, Dr. Matson. Perhaps you were not listening when I was replying to your speech. He said, Dr. Warren ought to grant me the opportunity to present my own case. Dr. Matson, that's what I've been pleading for you to do. I'm not only willing for you to do it, I'm pleading for you to do it. I'm doing all I possibly can to get you to do it. At the same time, I want you to recognize that as the negative speaker in this discussion, I have not only the right but the obligation to show you wherein you are failing, to show you what is involved in the affirmation you have made. You have affirmed a proposition that says, I know that God, that is the God of the Bible, does not exist. You have not really given one rational argument to that effect. You have given assertions. You have given subjective feelings. In the midst of your having already admitted in your book that for all you know, the infinite good God may exist and may, for all you know, have created God. So you see, in that admission, in his book, The Existence of God, there is no difference between us. That is the very interesting thing in this debate, that we have an alleged atheist and I now reduced not to talking really about the existence of God, but whether God can be good and punish man who is wicked. Do you see that? Do you see it, Dr. Matson? Do you see that you have admitted that for all you know, the infinite good God may exist? That if God is good, for all you know, he may exist. And that for all you know, he may have created man. That man may not be here by evolution. So the only question before us really has reduced itself to this. Can this infinite good God, whom Dr. Matson admits that for all he knows may exist, can he still be good and punished? Even for one moment. How much did he say about the array of stars? He promised he's going to get to them. Dr. Matson, at the rate you're going, you could be here next year and you wouldn't be to them. What did he say about my question as to how he decided what is evil? What is pointless suffering is over against pointed suffering, or suffering that has some point. And upon what ground do you decide what a possible infinite good God could or could not do by way of punishing a man who is in infinite rebellion? Which platform are you standing on, Dr. Matson, standing off out here, observing the infinite good God and deciding that he cannot punish? Let me ask you this. Did God punish man during this earth, during his life on earth? Did he give him even that much of a slap of the wrist? Suppose man does, as you have done here, in effect, stand up and blaspheme God and said you are grotesquely monstrous. Would it be commensurate with the goodness of God for him to punish you in some way? At least to rebuke you, to say, Wallace, you're doing the wrong thing. Would that be wrong? Would that mean that God then was no longer good just because he said you're not doing the right thing? Is a parent wicked because he punishes his child? A parent punishes his child because he loves him. I have 3 children, dear to me, I think, than life itself. I punished all of them, not because I didn't love them, but because I did. I have seen parents who claim to love their children and let them grow up in disobedience. I've seen children spit in the face of their parents, slap them and kick them, and they did nothing. That was not an act of love. It is an act of love that God says sin is terrible. There is this deterrent element of the punishment of God, do not sin. And God said to man when he put him in the garden, of every tree of the garden, thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. There was God Almighty's effort to deter man from sin. And throughout the Word of God, there is that effort to keep man from sinning, to keep him from doing wrong, to try to get him to do right. It is the ideal or intentional will of God that no one should ever sin one time. In 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1, the Bible says, my little children, these things write I unto you, that you may not sin. There is the ideal or intentional will of God. But what then if man does sin, and he has? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. John goes on in 1 John 2:1. But if any man sin, we have an advocate, Jesus Christ the righteous. You see, there is then the will of God in the circumstance of our sin. And down to the long ages of the Old Testament, God is saying this, Christ is coming. Christ is coming. There is a way out of your sin. In spite of the fact that Dr. Wallace Matson stands here tonight and in effect spits upon the way of God, God still loves him. He still gave his Son to die for him. He still wants him to be saved. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. The will of God in the circumstance of man's sin is that you respond to him in trust and belief and love and obedience, and that you can then be saved by the power of the blood of his Son, by which sin can be washed away, Ephesians 1 and 7. Now we as human beings, because we are free, can defeat the ideal will of God. We can fall into sin. And we can defeat the intentional or the circumstantial will of God, in that even after we have fallen into sin, we can reject God's appeal by the gift of his Son. That's what this world, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and human life is all about, our response to God Almighty. But you cannot defeat the ultimate will of God, which Dr. Matson himself read tonight from Matthew 25:46, when in the judgment, that great and awful day when all of us shall be there, and there is the great division between the righteous and the wicked, those who responded to God and those who have not. Those on the right hand will hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joys of thy Lord. Not all the forces of evil will be able to prevent God from saving every one of them. Nor all the forces of evil can prevent God from punishing forever those who are wicked. These shall go away into eternal punishment. God Almighty can be defeated at his ideal or intentional will, his circumstantial will, but not his ultimate will. Now, Dr. Matson has said nothing whatever other than his own subjective assertion in regard to that. I want to bring before you again the fact that he has admitted that for all he knows, the infinite God who is good exists. But he says if he punishes anybody one moment of time for anything, no matter how heinously rebellious, then he is wicked. Would God be wicked, Dr. Matson, if he punished Adolf Hitler for one moment? Would he? Would you answer that? For one moment, would God be wicked if he punished Hitler for one moment? Would he be guilty of wrongdoing if he punished Hitler during his lifetime for one moment? He would be wicked if he punished. Would men be wicked as they punished Hitler and all of his cohorts for what they did to the Jews? No, it's right for man to do it and not God to do it. See, when you're wedded to a viewpoint and you're determined to hold to it, then you will take this kind of absurd position. Now let me see what I may have yet seen. I want to go now to his contention about the body. He says, what I deny is the reassembled body would be me. I want to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 35 to 38. And I submit to you that there is no way in this world known to Wallace Matson or anybody else that this isn't true. But now he has taken his case on this. He has said, for all I know, a good, infinite God may exist and may have been the creator of man. Now he comes along and says, even though he may have created man, he could not have resurrected, or he could not resurrect his body. But let us see. But some will say, how are the dead raised, and with what manner of body do they come? Thou foolish one, that which thou sowest is not quickened except it die. And that which thou sowest not the body that shall be, but a bare grain, and may chance of wheat or some other kind. But God giveth it a body even as it pleased him, and to eat a body of its own. Now, if the God of heaven could create man, bring the world into being from nothing, and create man, which Dr. Wallace Matson has admitted may be the case for all we know, then certainly he could resurrect man. Besides that, surely, Dr. Matson, as you think about the continuity of your own self as a unique center of personality, you are aware of the fact that your physical body changes, that it changes completely, as I recall, every 7 years. So figure how many years you've been living, how many times your body must have changed. Are you still Wallace Matson? Not any longer you, I suppose. Let us look at 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Well, I wonder who it is over here to my left. His body's changed, so it's not him any longer. At any rate, he's debating the proposition that Wallace Matson signed. And I think it right, as long as I'm in this tabernacle, to stir you up by putting you in remembrance, knowing that the putting off of my tabernacle cometh swiftly, even as our Lord Jesus Christ signified unto me. There is, of course, the sense in which I am involved in my body. There's also the sense clearly taught in the Bible. This is a biblical viewpoint. We're talking about the God of the Bible, that I live in my body. My body is an instrument of my mind. I move that finger by thinking. My body is my instrument. I either work and serve God or I work against him by my body. My body changes physically, but still there is a continuity of identity. The Bible makes clear that when we die, we put off the physical body. The soul continues to live. It will be in a place waiting for the resurrection in which the body will be resurrected, changed, and reunited with the Spirit, and then all men will be gathered before God in judgment. My friend, certainly if God can create, as Dr. Wallace has admitted, certainly he can resurrect the body. That answers everything he said along that line, everything he said by way of claiming to have made an argument that involves a contradiction in regard to the concept of God has been nothing but a mere assertion. It is not a real rational argument, and his point that at death we cease to exist and God cannot be perfectly good and punish for the reason that he's the creator, but man can punish because he's not man's creator, simply is absurd and makes no sense whatever. Apparently he holds that men can punish and be good, but if God punishes, it's wrong. He's not made one rational argument against a good, infinite God. I want you to note that. He has admitted the possibility that the good, infinite God exists and may be the creator of man. He has not made one rational argument, not even an attempt to make a rational argument against a good, infinite God, but assumes that if God punishes, he is not good. All right, now let's look at the chart on evil, chart number 36C. Dr. Matson, I'd like you to give attention to this, if you would, please, sir. I want to show you the basic logical thrust of what he tries to do in regard to the problem of evil. Here's the concept of God as infinite. By deduction from that, he goes to the concept of the world God would have created if he existed. Then he observes the existing world. Evil exists. He holds in his argument the world is not perfect. Now, he hasn't really argued that tonight. He's gone almost totally and completely to the concept of punishment. But in his book, he argues about the world not being perfect. Well, let us add then, if we suppose, another circle out here and make it punishment. I'll put a P there for punishment. So this becomes the combined evidence. He then observes this, forming concepts and drawing conclusions. By deduction, he then concludes that God does not exist. Now, that's the closest that he has come to really giving us anything at all, and he didn't do that. I have formulated it for him. Now let's look at 36E. If an infinite and perfect being exists, then whatever else exists must be compatible with his will. Only the existence of perfection is compatible with the will of a perfect being. The world is not perfect, therefore an infinite and perfect being does not exist. All right? 36E1. Now, Dr. Matson's argument is not really complete as he has given it, and he will pardon me if I go into it just a bit more to make clear exactly what he is saying. If God exists and if the world exists, then the world exists if the world exists, if that is the world is compatible with God's will. If the world exists and is compatible with God's will, then if the world is perfect, that is, it is good with no evil whatever, and he will include punishment in that. Now I'm adding to that, and you'll see that what I'm adding are the things, the propositions in brackets. 2A, I'm calling that because it really is sort of an embellishment or adding what he needs in the second proposition. If evil exists and the world is not perfect, he doesn't say that in his argument. Secondly, he will assert that evil does exist. That would have to be there for his argument to be worth anything. Third, therefore the world is not perfect. Propositions 2A, 2B by modus ponens argument. Therefore, we have two more, or the need for several more arguments or propositions in addition to that. It is false that both the world exists and the world is compatible with God's will. 2 and 3 by modus ponens. 3B, either it is false that the world exists, or it is false that the world is compatible with God's will. 3A by De Morgan's theorem. Third, the world exists. 3C. 3D, it is false that the world is compatible with God's will. Propositions 3B, 3C by disjunctive syllogism. 3E, it is false that if the world exists, then it is compatible with God's will. A conjunction is true only when all the conjuncts are true. One is false. Here, of proposition 3C. 4, therefore, it is false that God exists. Conclusion drawn by the atheist Dr. Matson. Now, notice carefully. As the atheist admits, any argument which has even one false premise is of no force at all, as he says in his book, The Existence of God, page number 131. In the above argument, as the atheist uses the expression involved, at least the following propositions are false. 2, 2A, 3, 3A, 3B, 3D, 3E, and 4. For the purpose of this discussion, it will be sufficient to show that the atheist's argument from evil is of no force at all, to show that propositions 2A and 3 are false, and I have done it. I've also replied to the only other thing he had to say on that in regard to punishment. Let me, in the moment's closing, say something about his questions, and I'm afraid I left them over there. The answers that he gave to my question. In question number 5, I asked him, in torturing and or murdering 6 million Jews, the Nazis were guilty of violating, please check all appropriate boxes. You'll put that up on the board, 86B, please, up on the screen. The law of Germany, the law of the United States, the law of England, the law of God, some of the law explained, or no law at all. Now, I want you to note right here in question number 5, he checked no law at all. And then parenthetically he explained, but I don't claim to be a lawyer. Dr. Matson, you don't have to be a lawyer to know that you do wrong when you break law. How do you do wrong without breaking law? How do you do wrong without there being some objective standard? The Bible teaches sin is the transgression of the law. The truth of the matter is he does not want to face up to the fact that to say that it was merely the law, some human law, is to throw himself into sheer subjectivity. And if that's the case, one person's idea is just as good as another. He wants to hold on to objectivity while he holds to atheism, and the two are simply incompatible. Talk about punishment and the goodness of God being incompatible. Atheism and objective morality are the things that are incompatible. The counter element of my response to evil, as I shall show you, the Lord willing, either in the next speech or tomorrow evening, will be to show that it is the atheism that's involved in logical contradiction and not theism. Thank you very much. We'll hear Dr. Matson now for the 5-minute rejoinder.
I think that basically what's happened is that Dr. Warren thought he had the gift of prophecy. That is to say, he thought that I would come here and regurgitate my book. And so he's been reading up on that and typing it out for display on this gadget and so on, and he continually talks about that and doesn't address the arguments that I am actually presenting. Well, that's his problem and not mine, and I will talk about the arguments of my book in my own good time if I choose to. I'm not really required to respond to non-responsive remarks. I must protest, though. I really think, Dr. Warren, that in a conversation of this sort, it is in violation of the spirit of the rules that I think are tacitly agreed upon to invoke what is called the odium theologicum. That is, not to rest content with pointing out my logical blunders or factual howlers or so on, but to do, as you have repeatedly done, accuse me of standing here and blaspheming. I think there ought to be a King's X on that, since you did invite me to discuss the question of the existence of God. And I suppose, to pious Christians, anyone who questions this, much less denies it, is ipso facto guilty of blasphemy. With that admission, could we hear no more about that? He has several times referred to my expression, grotesque monstrosity about God. I said he was a grotesque logical monstrosity, that is to say, a self-contradictory being, a chimera. I don't think that, in the sense intended, that is to be counted among my blasphemies. There are many interesting matters that Dr. Warren has brought up, which I will try to reply to from time to time, certainly not in the less than 3 minutes that I have now. I think it's quite clear to anyone who listens candidly that Dr. Warren had nothing to say in reply to my argument about the discontinuity of the body, nor did he have anything to say about the spirit except flatly to assert that it does continue after death, and he did not meet what I think most impartial referees would regard as an argument to the contrary. He brings up again and again my alleged concession that a perfect God may exist and may have created man, and then tries to turn that into my giving up on the whole thing. This is only a reference, I repeat, and I hope that this will be for the last time because it's really very tiresome. I repeat that was only a modest assertion of my own fallibility. Now, as for the rest, I haven't time really to go into the matter of God's punishment of the wicked. I think since Dr. Warren has addressed a number of rhetorical questions to me, I'll simply close with one to him. He did say that he loves his children and he has punished them. With a blowtorch in the face, Dr. Warren, and if so, for 1 second, for 1 minute, for 10 minutes, for an hour.
Dr. Matson, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to be here for the last speech of this evening. I was rather surprised when Dr. Matson stopped. He certainly didn't take the 5 minutes that was assigned to him, if our timekeeping is correct, but rather surprised me when he stopped so abruptly. But I want to say that if he feels that I have wronged him in any way in my statement in regard to his speaking blasphemy, I want to say that I'm sorry, though I do want to say that in my viewpoint, Dr. Matson, it is blasphemy for one to call God grotesque and monstrous, even if you do append the adjective logical. So I have the right, I suppose, to my viewpoint as well as yours. And if you continue to make that kind of statement, I shall continue to respond to it. He said Dr. Warren had nothing to say about his argument on the discontinuity of the body other than mere assertion. That simply is not true. I made clear that given his admission, and he said he's tired of hearing about it, but until you take it back, Dr. Matson, you shall hear more about it. Now, if you would like to take it back and say that it's not true, you don't just write things in books being facetious or playing games by writing things like, for all I know, the infinite God may exist. If surely you're not saying that that's what you were doing when you wrote that, or that you were somehow or other just trying to give a modest statement. Were you trying to give a modest statement when you really didn't believe you were being modest? Are you saying you didn't mean the statement? Now, you either meant it or you didn't, so if you will make clear to us that you didn't really mean it, then you see we can go back and talk about that God. And then we can talk about you're either giving up your book or this proposition. You see, you tried to escape giving up the book or the proposition by saying in the book you weren't talking about the God we're talking about tonight. And so now when it's pressed upon you, you say you're tired of it, you want me to quit saying it, and you're saying that you didn't really mean it. Now, if that's the case, then we can go back to asking you which one you're going to give up, the proposition or the book. You're not going to escape quite that easily, Dr. Matson. Now let's look at question number, or chart number 68L and 68M, 68N. No, I'm sorry. I want to skip that and go on to the sixth question because I've already considered that, and I want to go on to this one. True or false? If you had been a soldier during World War II, and if the Nazis, number one, had captured you, and two, had given you the choice of either joining them in their efforts to exterminate the Jews or being murdered, you would have had the objective moral obligation to die rather than to join them in the murder of Jewish men, women, and children. And he answered, it's true. Now talk about something that is self-contradictory. Here's a man who holds that we are here as a result of nothing of intelligence, nothing of life, that our origin goes back to non-living matter, which he has to know is eternal. You will notice that he has not touched that, and he will not touch it, not with a 10-foot pole. He has already admitted that life does not come from non-life, therefore atheism could not be true. And yet all of this which has come into existence by sheer blind accident, he now says that he would have the obligation, the objective moral obligation, to die rather than to join the Nazis in their murder of the Jews. Dr. Matson, we have pleaded, we have begged, we have cajoled, we've done all we know how to do to get you to tell us why and how you would have such an obligation. If all there is to us is matter, if nothing exists but matter, why on earth would anybody give his life for anybody else? That absolutely makes no sense. A man who can see a contradiction in a good God being infinite in justice and holiness and righteousness, as well as in goodness, and then cannot see that contradiction really escape my ability to understand. All right, thank you very much. I hope you'll be back with us tomorrow evening. We'll continue these matters.
Thank you for watching this video. If you like this content and if you want to see more of it, please leave a like on the video and be sure to leave a comment underneath telling us what you thought about the video. And please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Alright, I hope everyone has a great day.